Hello, this is Robert Patrick. I'm going to redo the Coffeehouse Chronicles movie that I sent for the Coffeehouse Chronicles in October with some additions and some corrections. Okay, here we go. This is the Coffeehouse Chronicles of Robert Patrick. I am Robert Patrick in Los Angeles in 2006. I was born in 1937 in Texas. Here I am with my mother, the most important person in my life, in a landscape typical of those where I grew up. We were what are called grapes of wrath people. There was no significant art about us but the movies. Here are my mother and father in photos they sent each other during World War II, consciously trying to look like movie stars. My salvation was that my mother read to me constantly. I learned it quickly, and books became more than life to me. On my first day of school, I insisted on carrying my favorite books with me. I grew up to be a Southwest art fairy. We moved around so much that the first year I ever went to one school for a whole year was my senior year of high school in Roswell, New Mexico. You can tell what someone of my generation was like by what role he was cast in the school production of Our Town. I was cast as Simon Stimpson, the outcast artist. I was no better socialized in college in Portales, New Mexico. I was constantly getting cast in plays and then dropping out of them before they opened. I was thrown out of college for stealing art books from the library. I did manage, however, to do a few musical numbers in the school variety shows before I left. I went back home where I became a babysitter. It was all the use they had for me. All photos of me at the time show me sitting with my sister's children. I was more or less thrown out of the family and joined the Air Force. I was thrown out of the Air Force because they found love poems to another airman in my wallet. I figured that the entire world couldn't be crazy, it must be me. So I had myself put into the state mental institution in Las Vegas, New Mexico. They kept me for the required 2 weeks and then kicked me out, telling me, there's nothing wrong with you, you only need to move to a bigger town. I moved instead briefly to a smaller one, Kennebunkport, Maine, where I worked at the Playhouse. Its owner, Bob Curry, took complete advantage of my energy and my interest in the arts and made me do everything. When Penny Fuller washed her hair in South Pacific, I was the one waiting off stage to dry it. I got to act. Here I am in a musical called Head and Shoulders. The man doing the dip is Glenn Dubose, who by coincidence later directed Lanford Wilson's first play of the Chino. I was thrown out of summer stock because the summer ended. I stopped off in New York to see a college friend, intending that night to take a bus back to New Mexico. But I followed a beautiful boy down a side street in Greenwich Village into a tiny storefront, which turned out to be the Cafe Chino. Inside, the ceiling twinkled with tinsel, and there were little ice cream chairs. It was like fairyland. The waiter, for that indeed, that is who I followed, Johnny Dodd. He turned out to be the waiter at the Chino, and also a genius with lighting, who had a gimcracky lighting board, did brilliant original lights for the plays. The owner of the place was Joe Chino. Joe was a dancer who got too fat and opened a coffee house. His lover, Johnny Torrey, was brilliant and rigged the wiring of the Chino so it got electricity for free from the subway lines and could afford Johnny's lights. He also rigged the payphone so that we could make calls on it for free. Joe allowed people to do plays. The waiters and waitresses were marvelous actors and writers. Here are Hope Stansberry and Hal Borsky, both of them, both actors and writers. He started letting people do plays at least by December '58. This is the first known photo of a play done at the Chino. It is Dorothy Parker's Here We Are, done by Ron Faber and Helen Honkamp, under the direction of Bob Dada, who made the Chino a place where people came to see plays. At first, the Chino did mostly old plays. Here are Mary Boylan and Bob Dada in a Thornton Wilder play. Here are Marion Gaines, Mary Boylan, and Gwen Van Dam in Tennessee Williams' Hello from Bertha. Here are Leigh Hunt and Richard Smithies in an Ionesco play. This is the poster for Fly Spray in 1960 by James Howard, said to be the first original play written for and produced at the Cafe Chino. More people did original plays. Edith Laurie did The War versus Women. Two of Ruth Krause's one-line plays were produced there by Lawrence Saccharow. Joe himself appears here in Owen G. Arno's Street of Good Friends with Mary Boylan and Margaret Mitchell. The person who made the Chino a place where people went to see exciting original plays was a handsome redhead named Doric Wilson. We were all in love with handsome Doric. Here is a scene from his very first play, And He Made a Her, an Adam and Eve play. This is Paxton Whitehead and Doric's muse Jane Lowry in that play in 1961. A woman named Clarice Nelson, an actress as well, also produced plays there. Here's her The Rue Garden with Linda Eskenis and Ron Willoughby. David Starkweather, we were all in love with handsome David, was profoundly intellectual. He did both brittle satiric comedies like So Who's Afraid of Edward Albee and touching avant-garde plays like You May Go Home Again. Here's Lanford Wilson, the Mozart from Missouri, who seemed incapable of writing a dull line. We were all in love with handsome Lanford. Here's an early production of his at the Chino, Home Free, with Michael Warren Powell and Joanna Miles. Michael played a boy whose sister, Joanna, is pregnant with his child, and she has promised him he never has to go out there into the wicked world, so she dies of a heart attack, since he won't go out to get her help. Here's a lighter play of Lanford's. This is Jenny Ventris and Martha Galpin as a plain roommate based on me and a pretty roommate based on Lanford, for we were roommates at the time. Lanford connected with the Chino director, Marshall Mason, and they pretty much started their move to world fame. We were all in love with handsome Marshall. Here is Lanford's most popular play at the Chino, The Madness of Lady Bright. That's Tom Brigano, Neil Flanagan, and Lucy Sylvain. This play was Joe Chino's favorite, and he kept that photo of it behind his espresso machine always. Lady Bright was played by Neil Flanagan. Neil was a seasoned professional as a writer and director, and he taught us amateurs, who probably most of us wouldn't have done plays at all if Joe hadn't given us his floor to do them on. He taught us some professionalism and was a great help. He was also considered the greatest actor off-Broadway. He was our John Barrymore, and our Jack Benny poured into one. I saw a place there by Paul Foster. We were all in love with handsome Paul. Paul wrote dark, Beckettian, enigmatic plays. Balls was a existential puppet show. Hurrah for the Bridge was a dark, dark play about a pushcart man attacked by gangsters. I think this is from the La Mama production. Many plays played both the Chino and the La Mama and other places once there came to be other places. So I saw plays by handsome Daniel Haven Clark. We were all in love with Daniel Haven Clark. He wrote sour plays about metropolitan sex and theater life, usually starring his beautiful sister Connie. You understand, all these different worlds were realized in this tiny, tiny space. We just shoved tables back and did the shows, or sometimes people laid a little platform down for a playing space that seldom was even 8 by 8 feet. One of the most surrealistic and fantastic worlds created in the Chino was the world, or many worlds, of playwright H.M. Katukas. He was our poet, the most characteristic of the Chino playwrights, the one who could not have existed, or at least come to exist anywhere else, though his plays have since been done many, many places. Harry created a language for us. For instance, he was the first person I know ever to call pretty young men twinks. He called his stage manager, Renee Mogan, a clutter coordinator, and invented other phrases I can't really repeat in a family video. Katukas was more than capable of writing profound poetic plays like his Medea, here played by the incredibly original actor Charles Stanley. But many of his plays created metaphors for the Chino. Here's All Day for $1 about lost toys or broken toys in heaven. Certainly a metaphor for the Chino. Everybody did almost everything. Here's director Bob Heide acting, director Ron Link acting, dancer actor Charles Stanley acting. This is Elizabeth Shanklin. Another play of Harry's that was a metaphor for the Chino was Turtles Don't Dream, in which the Chino was presented as the broken down temple of a sacred cobra cult. This is from a later Theater for the New City production of it. Harry actually did the play for one night at Carnegie Hall, of all places. The actress playing the High Priestess here is Mary Boylan. She was more or less Harry's muse. Mary, by a genetic defect, looked many years older than she was, so she made her living playing old women in movies. But Harry wrote plays which brought out her strength, her beauty, her intelligence, and her sexuality. This Valentinesque creature is Tom Ian. We were all in love with handsome Tom. Tom's plays had the size and scale of opera, but the clarity of comic books. They were so popular that they even had sequels. Here's a poster for the sequel to Why Hannah's Skirt Won't Stay Down, called Who Killed My Bald Sister Sophie? The actors are Steve Davis, we were all in love with handsome Steve, Connie Clark, and Helen Hampt, who was the female equivalent of Neil Flanagan, certainly the greatest actress of off-Broadway. Bette Midler admitted that she used to come to the Chino to see Helen and modeled her Divine Miss M character on her. Here's a moment from Why Sophie's Skirt Won't Stay Down, with Connie and Steve Davis against Joe Bush's very, very beautiful set. And here's Tom himself in the Chino with Steve Davis, Helen, Steve's understudy Jack Quinn, Maggie Dominic, Charles Stanley, and his stage manager John Schmieder, who recalls a night when I, in arrogance and temperament, stormed out of the Chino during a show I had a skit in, and he came begging me back and placated me. The set against which they stand was painted by Joseph Bush, a multi-talented poet, playwright, painter, whose French Grey was done at the Chino. Joe was troubled as only someone that sensitive can be, and dropped out and disappeared way early and only surfaced now some 40 years later in Arizona. I hope for more work from him. Bob Heide created a dark metropolitan netherworld of total despair. Here are Jim Jennings and Walter McGinn in Bob's immortal The Bed, which had the lines, and I may be paraphrasing here, God is dead. No Nietzsche is dead. No sex is dead. No, we're alive. Those lines were actually chalked on walls around the village. Here's Bob's lover, John Gilman, in Bob's play Moon. Here's Bob Frink playing a straight man, and John played what is surely the first gay character in theater history to be superior in togetherness and organization to the straight people. He comes down and into a very neurotic straight world as the gay neighbor upstairs, and pretty much sets him straight. We were all in love with Handsome John. Here's another production of Moon with Victor LaPerry, Jackie Colton, and Jim Jennings. We were all in love with Handsome Victor and Jim. And here is Billy Hoffman, William M. Hoffman, as he is known as an anthologist and opera librettist and TV personality. We were, of course, all in love with Handsome Billy. His plays had a sharp, neurotic edge to them. Here's Neil Flanagan in his Thank You, Miss Victoria, about a yuppie who discovers a lot of things about himself when he accidentally chats with a telephone dominatrix. And we saw Dames at Sea with the radiant Bernadette Peters. I've only met 3 people whose genius was evident to me at first meeting: Lanford Wilson, Johnny Dodd, and Bernadette. There was no doubt she was a star from the first breath. These are Conrad Ward's posters. That's Norma Bigtree. Conrad was a great early photographer of Off-Broadway. Our window posters, this is the one for Dames at Sea, were made by dishwasher artist Kenny Burgess. The Chino was illegal. It was illegal to put on plays in the coffee house. So Kenny made posters that looked like abstract art to policemen, but the cognoscenti could read them and see what was going on that week. Here's the famous breadline scene from Dames at Sea, staged by Bob Dada on the tiny 8x8 stage. Bob Dada, there's Bob Dada, the director. When Dames at Sea went on to its great worldwide success, not only did they refuse to list the Chino as the place of its first production in the published version, they didn't take Bob Dada with them to direct it. He had created the show out of their script. He had shown them how it could be done with 6 people on a bare stage, and they dumped him. A story repeated far too often in off-Broadway history. We were all in love with Dames at Sea. For obvious reasons, no one was in love with me, but Joe Chino let me stay around because I was willing to do anything whatsoever that anyone needed done. I was doorman, I shopped, I waited tables, I washed dishes, you name it. Joe bought me this sombrero and West Point jacket to wear at the door. I wore it proudly. Harry Katukas in Turtles Don't Dream has a character based on me. She's called Greta Garbage. She goes out and sells wind-up tin cobras on 42nd Street to make money to keep the Cobra Temple going. Nobody thought much of me, but one person saw something in me. This is Andy Milligan, now famed as the director of cult movies, which back then were called exploitation or grindhouse movies. Andy also directed for the stage, and he got a date at a new place across town and asked me if I wanted to write a play version of Tennessee Williams' short story, One Arm. Well, I was very enthused. I'd never written a play or thought of doing so. However, as Andy began to explain what he wanted from it, it seemed far too gross and sleazy to me. So because I was a prude, I did not write the first play written for La Mama. However, I did meet La Mama, Ellen Stewart, a full force of nature. Ellen is brilliant, a visionary, extraordinarily determined, obviously beautiful, and her path and mine were to cross many times in the future. I did, however, write a play. I took it to Joe Chino, who threw it in the garbage unread, saying, "Bob, you don't want to become a playwright. You're a good guy, you work hard, you pull your weight around here. Playwrights are terrible people. You'll thank me for this in the future." However, Lanford Wilson, Tom Ian, and David Starkweather, who happened to be there, and who were at this time the reigning playwrights at the Chino, all insisted that Joe do my play on the basis that I worked so hard. Lanford, who was my roommate, also knew the play. So Joe did the play, and I'm afraid he was right. I became a terrible person, but I loved doing the play. This is the poster designed by Lanford. I became Robert Patrick by accident. The director, Marshall Mason, went off to have the poster printed and asked what names I wanted to use, and I said, well, I'll use Bob O'Connor for one and Robert Patrick for the other, because I don't want people to know I'm acting in my own play. By chance, he chose to use Robert Patrick for the playwright's name, and the play was such a success that it behooved me to remain Robert Patrick forevermore. Had I known I was going to be a playwright, I would have chosen a name like Dominique Tamerlane. Well, too late for that. This is William Hoffman and me in The Haunted Host. Neil Flanagan wanted to play the haunted host. I, fool that I was, proud, arrogant fool that I was, didn't want the same man who had played in Lanford's gay play, Lady Bright, to be in mine, and so I played the part. And the audience was robbed of the brilliance Neil would have brought to it. He did get to play it later with great success. I also did Indecent Exposure, a play about a young man who walks the streets of New York naked with his draft card strapped to his arm in protest against the Vietnamese War. Lanford directed it, and George Langeris here played the boy. Johnny lit it with a single ordinary light bulb overhead. I also did The Warhol Machine at the Chino. This is Kenny's abstract poster for The Warhol Machine. In The Warhol Machine, a soldier returns from Vietnam to discover that his girlfriend, brother, and mother have voted a fascist regime into power. He's furious because he's been over fighting for democracy. He doesn't understand that they voted the fascist regime in because it promised there would be no more wars, and he, the soldier, would be safe. Here, the soldier, Bob Shields, tries to shoot the Warhol Machine, played by playwright Donald Cavaras, but his girlfriend jumps in between and he shoots her instead, while his mother, Anne Sachs, watches. This is Maggie Dominic in The Warhol Machine. Maggie was a playwright herself, but better known as a collagiste and a prize-winning poet and memoirist. This is Donald Cavaras as The Warhol Machine. That's Bob Shields as a soldier in the corner. Don was a very clever playwright who unfortunately died, and without ever achieving the fame he so deeply desired. There was a lot of craziness at the Chino and a lot of drugs. For an example of the craziness, Harry Katukas once laughed in the wrong place at a play and the cast walked out. So it was necessary to whip up a variety show. Here are Bob Dada, George Harris, Mary Boylan, Donna Tedesco, Walter Harrison behind him, his brother George, Jeannie Lanson, composer John Herbert McDowell, and dancer-actress Debbie Lee in the Spring Horror Show. There was also a lot of talent around the Chino. Speaking of drugs, here I am, out of my mind on LSD, emceeing the show while Neil Flanagan in the audience laughs. About the talent. This is a 5-minute skit Lanford wrote for the Spring Horror Show. Whipped it off just because it was needed. That's John Herbert McDowell, Marshall Mason, and Clarence Nelson in it. The play is still done all over the world. 40 years later, is it? I also did a skit in the show with Jeannie Lanson called Cheesecake, about an LSD trip, which is still being done. There was such talent there. I continued to write plays. Neil Flanagan got a date at La Mama and asked me if I had a play. I threw my newest one at him. It is called Mirage, and in this Conrad Ward photo we see Bill Mezzo and Jenny Ventris as the young couple settling the West. The audiences at La Mama loved it, but there were certain people there who looked down on me very much. You see, the La Mama audiences were accustomed to extremely avant-garde theater. Here are the devil dolls in Jean-Claude Van Natale's Motel, for instance. La Mama was the cutting edge of the avant-garde. Here, the most avant-garde director and playwright, Tom O'Horgan and Paul Foster, who, in lofts provided by Ellen Stewart, devised the workshop method of creating plays, where instead of a script just being written and rehearsed, the author, the director, the actors, composers, designers, all work on the play together in the workshop and create an organic, almost dance-like work. The most famous example was Paul Foster's Tom Paine. Here we see Lucy Sauvé, Rob Thurkeld, and that's Spalding Gray up there. In a touring production of it, Ellen Stewart sent it overseas, and it became the most influential play in American history. Imitations of it are still coming back to La Mama from all over the world and still being hailed as cutting edge and avant-garde. Here are Mary Claire Sharba, Sally Kirkland, Kevin O'Connor, Marilyn Robinson, and Beth Porter in, I believe, the original production. Tom O'Horgan also, in workshop with author Rochelle Owens, created Futz. Here's Marilyn Roberts about to give suck to Seth Allen. It's a play about a man that loves a pig, which upsets the town horribly. Here in the film version is Sally Kirkland riding said pig. But there were many kinds of avant-garde at La Mama. Jeff Weiss was psychologically avant-garde. This very young writer-actor from Pennsylvania created plays which were virtually monologues for himself, even when other people dropped in. Exploring his own madness, he proudly carried a certificate of insanity that the Army had given him in his wallet. His plays were directed by Ricardo Carlos Martinez, his lover and inspiration. Another kind of avant-gardism, Lanford Wilson did his most avant-garde play, The Rhymers of Eldridge, at the Chino. There's Clarence Nelson, Ann Harris, and Beth Porter. But another kind of avant-gardism, here's the El Dorado Players, a group of children that Ellen gave a workshop to. There's George Harris, who created it. These are some of his sisters. The Harrises were a remarkable family. Whenever we needed a child for a play at the Chino or La Mama, we would call the Harrises. Here's Jane Harris in Clarence Nelson's The Clown at the Chino playing a little boy. That's David Starkweather, Soren Agnew, Lanford Wilson, and Arnold Horton in the play. As I said, everybody did everything. We all acted, directed, wrote. Here is Walter Harris, who was unforgettable as Kenny in Lanford Wilson's The Sandcastle at both Chino and La Mama. Here's Father George Harris III, and George Harris II is somewhere in the production of Ronnie Tavel's Gorilla Queen at Judson Church. The outstanding figure of the Harris family was George Harris III. He was an alpha male born into a theater company, so he gave up a career as a mere actor and model to start theater troupes. Besides the El Dorado, he started the famous Coquettes, in which he is here costumed as his drag character Hibiscus. He also created the Angels of Light with his family, and most people now know that the famous blonde putting the famous flower in the famous rifle at the Pentagon is indeed George Harris III. But the kind of avant-garde theater that was most associated with La Mama is typified by this shot from Jean-Claude Van Natale's open theater production of The Serpent. I don't think The Serpent ever actually played La Mama, but this shot is typical of the sort of orchestra of flesh, a kaleidoscope of characters and drama and themes which La Mama expected. This dispute between realistic plays and avant-garde plays seemed to me superficial and unnecessary. It seemed to me that all plays use the same elements, merely in different proportions. Most bright people were not upset about it. What, after all, were the elements of the avant-garde? Simultaneous scenes, mythological imagery, ritual movement, dance, and nudity. Well, my so-called realistic plays had simultaneous scenes, mythological imagery, ritual movement, dance, and nudity. In fact, some of my plays had simultaneous scenes, mythological imagery, ritual dance, ritual movement, and nudity all at the same time. I just didn't see any dispute. Neither did anyone intelligent. Here's Tom O'Horgan, quite the most avant-garde of directors, with his then lover Harvey Milk, who later became famous as the mayor of Castro Street. Tom came to see all my realistic plays and just loved them. And here are Lanford Wilson and Marshall Mason, essentially realistic artists, who were always running into the Chino saying, oh, you've got to see this Charles Ludlam play, or you've got to see this open theater play. There was no real quarrel. Artists also became associated sometimes with one theater more than another, but everybody worked everywhere. Here's Al Carmines of Judson Church and Irene Fernez of no particular affiliation. Harry, associated mostly with the Chino, and director Larry Kornfeld, mostly associated with the Judson, all getting together at the Chino to plan the Judson production of Pomegranata. There really was no dispute. Here's Debbie Lee and Charles Stanley in drag doing a dance called Black and White and Sparkle Plenty at Judson. Now, some of the classicists at Judson thought this was outrageous, but most people just thought it was a wonderful extension of camp and pop art into the classical aura of the Judson. Despite these petty feuds, there was wonderful camaraderie and fellowship off-Broadway. When the Chino had a fire, Ellen Stewart gave Joe Chino the stage at La Mama to do his plays on until the Chino was repaired. Here he is on Kenny Burgess's set for Frustrata, and here the set is in use for Tom Ian's Frustrata. Everyone from off-Broadway and off-Broadway contributed to a big benefit to restore the Chino. Here's Joe at the benefit with playwright Edward Albee. I'm at their feet, by the way, folding programs, temple slaving to the end. Here are some very rare shots of plays done in the benefit. This is Lanford's The Sandcastle, which later played both the Chino and La Mama. That's Michael Warren Powell in the red shirt. Here is Gertrude Stein's Three Sisters Who Are Not Sisters, directed by Michael Smith with Diane Fisher, Deborah Lee, and Marva Abraham, which later played the Judson. The benefits were a great success. They got a lot of publicity. And the Chino reopened with, much more decoration and with posters blatantly posted. Kenny didn't have to make them hard to read anymore. The place was actually getting famous. Here the Chino is decorated by Kenny for a special occasion. And here are an unknown, Harry's stage manager Renee McGann, actress Judy Eckert, and Eddie Barton, all standing right out in front of it, just like they were decent people. Things were changing. When Ellen Stewart's La Mama was threatened with closing by the city for fire code violations, Paul Foster and I organized a benefit called Bang. We called it Bang because the papers then wouldn't print our real title, Gang Bang. What we did was we called all the playwrights we knew. We knew every playwright, just like us, had 2 or 3 minute plays that he'd never found a place to produce. So we told like 29 of them, get those on their feet and get them to La Mama by Tuesday. Here are Marilyn Roberts and Ron Link in Bob Heidi's enigmatic statue. Here are Harvey Selsby, Sharon Gans, and Jeannie Lanson in Lanford's hilarious skit, Miss Williams, about people who design weather. Here's Marilyn Roberts in Billy Hoffman's very lyric play, Invocation, looking for love among the trucks. Here is Steve Davis and Countess Ruth York's play. Steve plays art news editor Kenward Elmsley, a good friend of Ruth's, stepping out into life. Ruth was an old avant-gardist from Berlin. She lived on the same street as the Chino, revered us, called us the new avant-garde, and we learned a great deal from her. She's greatly missed. Here's Joyce Aaron in Remy Charlotte, John Dodd, and Michael Smith's play. I like it. She is seducing herself. Here is Stephanie Gordon in a political skit by Leonard Melfi. Here are Hal Borsky and Bob Dada and an unidentified woman in Donald Kavaris's loony prediction of a time when the sexes will blend. Here's Roy London and no one is sure who the girl is, in Jean-Claude Van Natale's The Soldier and the Girl, a very oblique abstract piece. Here's Bob Dada in a straightforward a parody of Religion by Mary Mitchell. Here's Steve Davis and Connie Clark and her brother Daniel Haven Clark's raunchy Big Bad Lula's Dance of Desire. Here's Charles Stanley as Jean Harlow in Katukas' Kill Kaleidoscope Kill. He had the deathless line as Jean Harlow, "When I had my period, 400 people didn't work." Here's Barbara Bowman in Ted Harris's gentle, sad, Black Dreams. Here's Sam Shepard watching his play, of which there unfortunately is no photo, and eating his finger. On the right you see a recent photo of him, still eating that same finger. The incredible variety of Bang convinced doubters, and actually convinced us artists, that we were indeed a movement, a typically American movement, because there had never been a manifesto, a set of principles. Joe Chino gave us his floor and said, "Do what you have to do," and it created the greatest blossoming of theater in the history of the world. By, I think, 1966, there were 300 off-Broadway theaters listed in the Village Voice, almost all of them doing a new American play every week. There cannot have been a flowering of theater to equal it in all history. Here was the first really solid public recognition of off-Broadway, the Obies, which was Off-Broadway Awards. Off-Broadway Obie, get it? Presented a special Obie to Ellen Stewart and Joe Chino. That's Gloria Foster and Michael Smith presenting it. It was the first Obie given to any off show, and here's the Obie to prove it. Things were changing. Mary Claire Sharba and Jacqueline Colton took a play of Tom Ions, the white horn, the bit player, touring abroad. Here they are in Denmark. They also did the play at Chino and La Mama. As I say, things were changing. Off-Broadway was growing. Sam Shepard, Paul Foster, and Lanford Wilson had plays produced by the prestigious off-Broadway producers Albee Barr Wilder. Ellen Stewart produced, I think it was 6 La Mama plays off-Broadway. I wasn't all that happy about changes. The Chino was the only place I'd ever been that I hadn't been thrown out of. I wasn't sure I wanted it to change. It all reached a peak when the New York Times in 1965 finally decided to acknowledge the existence of off-Broadway. They did a big article called The Pass Your Hat Theater Circuit. They included photos of only 3 individuals: Joe Chino, Sam Shepard, and me. Sam and I were by no means the preeminent playwrights of off-Broadway at this point. That would have been Lanford Wilson and Paul Foster, hands down. I believe the only reason they printed mine and Sam's photos out of the thousands they took was that we looked dissolute and degraded and maybe a little degenerate. And I think that was really their idea of people who acted and wrote for free. At any rate, you wouldn't believe the jealousy and anger and spite that mine and Sam's picture being in the paper caused. I had thought that we were above and beyond ambitions for the tacky uptown theater. I was apparently wrong, and I was very bitter about the way I was insulted because of these photos. So bitter and insulted that when Life magazine came down to take a rooftop photo across the street from the Chino, of the off-Broadway playwrights, I refused to go. I deeply regret that now. I should like to see myself among my dearest friends and the people I loved most in the world back when we were all young and pretty and alive. Life never printed the picture, but nonetheless, off-Broadway had changed, and I wasn't that happy about it. And that is the end of part 1. Coffeehouse Chronicles, Robert Patrick, Part 2. With success came many more people, much more work. The Chino was a tiny place, even with full houses all the time. It really couldn't pay anybody. That just made more work for all of us. Joe was the most overworked of all. He became very confused. I'm afraid much more into drugs as well. Joe's lover, Johnny, Tori, fled and then died. Joe got deeper and deeper into drugs and was more and more morose, even though the Chino continued to produce fabulous works. Here's Sam Shepard's Icarus's Mother, with members of the Open Theater. John Guare premiered 2 one-acts at the Chino. But another kind of people started coming down too. The success of the Chino drew success-crazy Warhol wannabes. I'm afraid they brought with them more drugs than we had ever dreamed existed, and things got pretty crazy. Here is a scene in Soren Ingenoux's Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. There's Soren as Mrs. Cratchit, and me as Marley, Scrooge's dead partner. I did not remember being blonde, wearing that suit, or doing this scene until someone showed me this photo, and I recognized that that was me by my unmistakable shadow on the wall. These photos are no more blurry than my mind was during that drug-soaked time. Joe and his friends did very strange shows. Here's one called Cobra Invocations, whose point or purpose no one could understand. Joe did one last dance concert with Charles Stanley, Deborah Lee, and James Waring at Judson Church. I didn't get to see it because I was managing the Chino that night. And eventually Joe killed himself, and no longer from behind the tinkling bells was his voice heard, raised ebulliently to say, "It's magic time." We went ahead and did the shows that Joe had scheduled. The first one after his death was Clarence Nelson's The Clown. That's me, Lanford Wilson, and Marshall Mason in it. We were much criticized for doing a lyric comedy right after Joe's death, but the people who criticized us didn't understand Joe's basic message of joy. The costumes, by the way, were done by Michael Warren Powell, a figure of some importance in off-Broadway history. Michael Heerenfatz not only was a brilliant actor in Lanford's plays and La Mamadou plays and many others, he also later started a theater to help young playwrights. We were also criticized when we went to Joe's funeral, dressed in gaudy, campy costumes. As I say, the people who criticized us didn't understand. Joe had called us his Rockettes. He admired very much the indefatigable spirit of Radio City Music Hall's dancing girls who went on no matter what and made pleasure for the people. This is Joe's own Radio City Rockettes pennant, loaned to me for scanning by John Borsky. Charles Stanley took over the Chino for a while. It was a tremendous amount of work, and things were pretty crazy. He ceded the ownership of it after a while to Joe's very, very good friend, Michael Smith, who worked very hard to straighten it out and get it back on a reasonable path. Under Michael, Lanford's brilliant This Is the Real Speaking was done, and the new playwright Soren Ingenoux did Donovan's Johnson. Debbie Lee did did Wallace Stevens, Carlos Among the Candles. Charles himself wrote 2 plays. Here he is in his very frightening solo play, opening July 4th for Joe. We did comic books. One night, when no show showed up, lighting man Donald Brooks suggested doing a comic book. We did one called Wonder Woman. After Joe's death, we continued to explore this interesting pop field. Here's Snow White, with Maggie Dominic as Snow White and me as a very skinny Doc. Phoebe Ray did Joe Bush's brilliant French Grey, directed by Roberta Sklar, a play about Marie Antoinette in prison, in which Joe wrote for Phoebe the deathless line when people complained about her spending state money on her diamond necklace. She says, "They say I took bread from people's mouths, but people don't eat diamonds. Style is a heavy responsibility, and magnificence costs money." We did a play by Ronnie Tavel, directed by his brother Harvey Tavel. Here is Mary Warnoff in her vinyl costume for Vinyl, an extremely violent and gory version of Clockwork Orange. Hal Borsky wrote for himself a camp play about the god of the wind exiled to an island called The Brown Crown, which he played with Irving Metzman and Walter Harris. We did plays by Lawrence Ferlinghetti. The last play done at the Chino was by Dion de Prima, a lyric poem play called Monuments. There were also revivals. Here's Tom Ian's Why Hannah's Skirt Won't Stay Down and My Bald Sister Sophie. While these plays were on, the cops laid so many summonses on us that we thought the place would have to close. It got to where whenever a cop approached, I'd whistle outside, and Steve and Helen would jump off stage and join customers at a table so we could pretend it wasn't a theater. We celebrated the 200th performance of Neil Flanagan in Lanford Wilson's Lady Bright. Great things happened for me. I wish Joe had been there to see me get my first publication of a play by a young editor from Chicago who happened to wander into the Chino the night a play of mine was on. Unfortunately, the reason my play was on was that some druggy people's play hadn't showed up. I also did my lights, camera, action after Joe died. Here is a play from it, Camera Obscura, with Denny Leone and Kathy McAlpine in a much later production. There are no pictures of the first production, which was, I am told, the first play ever done nude. Some people from Los Angeles decided to do a play of short mini plays like the ones we'd done in Bang, called Collision Course. They were short of play, and Lanford Wilson and Sam Shepard and I don't remember who else who was in it said, "You've got to do a play of Bob Patrick's. He invented these plays." So they did Camera Obscura, and I suddenly had an income, for it was done worldwide after it was published. For no reason whatsoever that can be laid on any person, the fault of no one whatsoever, the Chino closed. Without Joe, it just wasn't the same place. It was just a theater, and there were, after all, bigger, better equipped theaters to work at. So the Chino closed. With my income from Camera Obscura, I didn't have to take office jobs anymore. So I became a bit of a hippie. Well, actually, pretty much of a hippie. Here I am with a lover nude, leading a nude be-in of students at New Paltz, New York. I did a lot of plays. I did many, many plays. They tell me I did more plays than anybody has ever done, except maybe a couple of Spanish playwrights in the Renaissance. I met a young actor, Joseph Pichette. It is generally agreed among people that after Neil Flanagan, Joe Pichette was the most brilliant actor off-Broadway ever saw. Even Jeff Weiss, who is called the greatest actor off-Broadway, says, no way. The brilliant, bitter talent of Joe Pichette is the greatest. Joe was the ideal actor for my plays. I fell in love with him and followed him to a place called the Old Reliable, a tavern theater in a neighborhood so squalid that one actress said the reason we get such big crowds is people are afraid to come alone. People like Bill Hoffman followed me from the Chino to the El Reliable, and Bobby Cabrera, his lover. There we met new people. Here's Blaise Koch from South Africa. Brilliant designer Charles Terrell worked at the El Reliable. Neil Flanagan saw Joe act and wanted to play with him, so he came to the El Reliable. Here they are in my Joyce Dynell. Victor LaPerry came over and played a rock singer in Joyce Dynell. Irving Metzman came and played a TV announcer in Joyce Dynell, and they all played many other plays there too. The ruling spirits of the Old Reliable were an actor named Ken Hill, who is here as Christ in Joyce Dynell, with playwright Joe Renard and actress Pitchelina Happy. The other ruling spirit was playwright-actress Janine Bales, here as Salome in my Joyce Dynell. New personalities emerged there. Here's Lamar Alford and Barbara Montgomery in a comic book show directed by Neil Flanagan, Pudd'nhead Wilson at the Old Reliable. Jeffrey Herman was a great Old Reliable star who went on to many other things. Bill Hayslip was a major Old Reliable star. Here are the two of them in my play Fog. The play is supposed to take place in the dark in a homosexual cruising ground, and here they're about to have a very embarrassing hand encounter in the dark. Bill also played with Jackie Colton in Joseph Bush's play. Oh dear, I can't remember the title. It's about a traveling saleswoman who unfortunately knocks at the wrong door and gets chained and beaten and killed by a sadist played by Bill. I think this is actually from the Playbox production, but it started at the Reliable. Joe Bush's Desaad Illustrated started at the Reliable and went to Off-Broadway. Here's David Gallagher, Zita Litmanos, and Bill Hayslip, who had all acted at the Chino and followed to the Reliable. In my Joyce Dynell, Neil Flanagan and Joe Pichette played John the Baptist and a party giver that a poet is in love with. They were the best actors I knew. So when I got an off-Broadway production of The Haunted Host, I cast Neil and Joe in it. Here they are in the off-Broadway production, my beautiful friends as I long to remember them. Alas, Joe, for some reason, preferred handsome men like Bill Hoffman and John Albano to me. I can't think why. I went pretty crazy. Here's a scene from Joyce Dynell in which Eddie McCarty, playing me, can't touch Joe. The scene was much discussed. I had Joe crucified at the end of the play on Rick Stafford, who was the kind of beautiful bodybuilder he preferred to me. Paul Foster could see that I was going nuts. Paul was rich from Tom Paine, so he paid for me to go to Europe, where I saw Ramses Shafi, the greatest actor of Holland, do The Haunted Host. Here's the only surviving photo from that Amsterdam production. Because of this and other things, I got a book published, Robert Patrick's Cheap Theatrics. You'll see the picture I chose for it was Michelangelo's Soul Condemned to Hell. I was in no great shape. Here's my photo taken for the cover of the book. You can see how worn and harried and crazy I looked. I continued to do plays. I did many, many plays. Sometimes I had to act in them. Here I am as Oscar Wilde. Here's Pontius Pilate in my play Judas. I even did a nude scene with Jack Wrangler and Dale Merchant in my play T-Shirts. I even did a drag role. Here I am as my character Antimatter, a crazy comic book sorceress. As Antimatter, I went to a 1985 tribute to the Chino at Lincoln Center and made a bit of a fool of myself, I'm sure. Here Neil Flanagan watches me at Lincoln Center. In fact, the only picture of me and the love of my life together, Joe Pichette, I am in Antimatter drag. I continued to do plays here, yon, there, and everywhere, so many that an almanac published a picture of me with actors dressed as characters from a few of my plays. During all this time, whenever Ellen Stewart needed me, I was there. Ellen needed someone to write words for Johnny Dodd's light show, City of Lights. So I came in and not only wrote, but acted the role of a philosopher who hears the barbarians coming and at first screams in horror that they're coming, but then starts beating a marble column to the beat of the barbarians' horses' hooves and winds up merrily dancing and singing, "The barbarians are coming, the barbarians are coming." This is also from City of Light. That's Lucy Sylvain, dancing nude. Unfortunately, photographer Jim Gossage didn't catch the moment when Lucy, a new mother, squeezed her breast milk onto the front row. Ellen needed someone to direct Paul Foster's Western musical, Silver Queen Saloon, so I came in and did so. When Meatloaf, the famous singer, left the cast 2 days early to go do the Rocky Horror Show, I had to take his role. This is me with his costumes, which wrapped twice around me then. They wouldn't now. The little boy in the play, by the way, is the actress Diane Lane. Ellen needed a Valentine show, so I did a review called Valentine Rainbow. Here, Irving Metzman discovers that his agent, played by Don Forrest, really is a monster. Charles Terrell made the costume. Joe Pichette, as Richard Wagner, discovers the difficulty of leaving the country when your lover is an absolute monarch like King Ludwig. Marilyn Roberts and John Albano played the richest girl in the world and the handsomest movie star in the world in The Richest Girl in the World Finds Happiness. Ellen needed a Christmas show, so I wrote play-by-play about what really goes on in actors' minds when they're on stage. There's Bobby Kubera as the page. Here, Irving Metzman as the character man tortures the leading man Joe Pichette into giving him an extra scene. And here Joe Pichette tries to give a to-be or not-to-be speech downstage, while Bobby Kubera and Denny Leone behave most unbecomingly with leading lady Deborah Rush. Ellen asked me to start La Mama Hollywood. I said, okay. Oh, I'm sorry. First thing she asked me to do was to stage manage the Meg and Terry Tomahorgan creation, Massachusetts Trust. Here's Mary Claire Sharba in it. Here's Jerry Cunliffe, Kevin O'Connor, and Fred Forrest. Here are, I think, Jerry Cunliffe and Peter Craig, and there's John Bakos. It was a wonderful play. And there's Clay Haney as the Pope. Ellen must have been happy with what I did as stage manager because she asked me to go to Haiti to start La Mama Port-au-Prince. I was thrilled until she told me that she could only afford a one-way fare. I wasn't sure I wanted to get hung up in Haiti, so I refused. She must not have been too angry because Ellen asked me to start La Mama Hollywood, which I did, gladly. Here they are in one of their opening shows, my play about working with alcoholic Indians called How I Came to Be Here Tonight. It was very well received. Also well received was the other show in the bill, Julie Bavasso's Schubert's Last Serenade. The plays were directed respectively by Jacqueline Colton and June Purrs from New York. Many people helped. Denny Leone and June Purrs and Ned Van Sant, Pitchlina Happy and Jacqueline Colton from New York. And a new discovery made out there, playwright Ross McLean. Ellen, however, I found that too many of the people we worked with were not really avant-garde types. They just wanted to do plays to audition for commercials, and I kind of cracked up and left. Ellen must not have been angry with me because she still smiled at me whenever we met. And about this time, I wrote a little play called Kennedy's Children, and that was the end of part 2. Coffeehouse Chronicles, Robert Patrick, Part 3. Kennedy's Children contains a character, a bitter, brilliant actor, based on Charles Stanley and Neil Flanagan. A young actor named Don Parker wanted to play that part very much. He optioned the play. For 3 years, he tried to sell it. No one would buy it. He sent me regular option checks. I cashed the checks first and then told him please not to waste his time. However, he believed in the show and persevered. Finally, he found a bankrupt pub in a slum in London which did theater. They were about to close and thought they might as well close with the play they liked, even though they didn't think anyone would come to see Kennedy's Children. The theater was called the King's Head, and there it is. They even flew me over, which is good because I was in terrible shape. There I am in front of the King's Head in my first hour in London. The play opened in the back room of this bankrupt pub, which expected to close. Here's Clive Donner's production of it. The next morning, I signed contracts for productions of the play in 60 languages. My favorite review ever is this one from South Africa. Best show south of the Limpopo. I was suddenly rich, famous, and even had a little power. I brought Joe Pichette and another actor that I was in love with over to London to do The Haunted Host, hoping one of them would be impressed enough by my new situation to fall in love with me. They fell in love with each other. So I was in really bad shape by the time Kennedy's Children opened on Broadway. It was great fun being a success. It was great fun having a cast like Don Parker, Shirley Knight, Don Travis, Michael Sachs, Barbara Montgomery, and Kailani Lee. It was fun seeing my face in the New York Times and the Village Voice. Take a look at that Voice headline. Can a kid from the Cafe Chino be really big, baby? It was great fun meeting Tennessee Williams. We met twice, and he called me once, and there was never a kinder, more compassionate man. It was fun seeing Shirley Knight win her Tony for the play. It was fun giving a young actor named Harvey Fierstein his first male role in The Haunted Host in Boston. It was fun discovering playwrights elsewhere like Geraldine Aaron and Peter Durkheis in Cape Town and bringing their work back to America. But frankly, it all was a little haggard-making. I wasn't really cut out for that world. I used my newfound success to affiliate myself with a high school theater organization called the International Thespian Society. And for 10 years, I traveled for them, lecturing at high schools, junior high schools, and colleges all over the country. Here's some of those gigs. I saw brilliant productions of my plays along the way. Here's two from Kansas. Joyce Cavarazzi did a brilliant expanded Kennedy's Children at a college in Wichita. Nadine Charlson did one of the best physical productions I've ever had of my play The Golden Circle at Hayesville High in Hayesville, Kansas. Here, for obvious reasons, is my favorite of the schools I visited. I visited over 1,000 altogether. During that 10 years, I also wrote columns for literally dozens of publications. I lectured at colleges, theater conventions. I was afloat in the San Francisco Gay Pride Parade. I dashed back to England often. In Cape Town, South Africa's preeminent photographer took movie star-looking photos of me. In Edinburgh, I passed out leaflets for my award-winning play, The Last Stroke, at the festival. I was brought to France to lecture on censorship in American theater and was stiffed of my fee. In Caracas, where they did T-shirts called camisetas, it was the first gay play ever done in Venezuela. The president of Venezuela declared that it would be the unofficial opener of the Venezuelan Theater Festival. Everything just looked brilliant. I was on every TV station, radio station, and all the newspapers. Then opening night came with all of Venezuela's celebrities there. Alas, no one had told the translator that it was a comedy. And it was the most dismal opening night I've ever had. I practically had to sneak out of Venezuela. But most of the places I visited, I wound up doing this, helping paint sets. as I do here for my friend Billy Houck at Eagle High School in Arroyo Grande, California. Also during that 10 years, I ran a theater for a year in LA. This is the Deja Vu Coffeehouse, model in the Chino, run by a man named Smitty. Here the stage is set for Ross McClain's play, Nelson 75. Here is Ross McClain. Here's the cast of Nelson 75, which much predated The Simpsons. Smitty needed saving. His roof had caved in and he needed a show that would make money. I brought my Blue is for Boys in. Here it is with Neil Flanagan as the lead. It saved the place, to put it mildly, and Smitty asked me if I wanted to run the theater next door. Here's Ross McClain in front of the Deja Vu, and right next door to it, here I am, in front of the Fifth Estate. I said, sure, if I can make it a gay theater. He thought that was great. Here is my beautiful little Fifth Estate theater set up for my play, for a revival of Blue is for Boys. And here it is in use for a raucous musical number from Blue is for Boys. I'm afraid I lasted only a year because Equity started hounding us and threatened to close the theater if we didn't meet outrageous demands. I said we could just use non-equity actors. But Smitty was afraid that if he did, the papers wouldn't review him. It turned out there was a secret agreement between the papers and Equity in LA that the papers wouldn't review any theater that Equity blackballed. So I left. I also worked for a year at a theater in Chicago called At the Drama Shelter. Here I am with Ron Hitchcock and Darrell Hale, who had created it. It was the longest running gay theater in America at the time, in 10 straight years. Here are Ron Hitchcock and Les Mirish in John Hopkins' All the Way Home at the Drama Shelter. I also worked for 2 summers at a theater in Hutchinson, Kansas. Here I got the chance to direct Cindy Cooper's wonderful play, Sisters. I also worked for a season in New York with Mark Warren and Ozzie Rodriguez at their theater, the Dramatics Risk. Here they are in a mural which I painted for the theater. But the most important thing I did in those 10 years was to work with a brilliant, dedicated young troupe called the Fourth E. There they are. We did plays by members. Here, for instance, is Ross McClain's Food, and here is Steve Nelson's The Golden Scepter. To pay for doing these plays, we did my plays. Here is the first one we did. We did our plays in a verminous ruin just down the block from La Mama. When I say verminous, the reason the floor is so shiny here is because we had to put down deterrent for termites, which otherwise would have covered the stage. This is Carol Nelson and Bonnie Young, the best cast of 2 I have ever had in our first production, my play My Cup Runneth Over, which I wrote for Marlo Thomas and Lily Tomlin about how one's life changes when one becomes a success. Here are Bonnie Young and Paul Mackley in my play Mutual Benefit Life, about a playwright with amnesia and how everybody around him tries to convince him of a different past for their own nefarious purposes. Here are Carol Nelson and Terry Talley in my version of Euripides' The Trojan Women. Here are Jim Del Priore, Midge Montgomery, and an actor playing the father in my play about a family, Nice Girl, a play which is about a family which is destroyed by superstitions about sexuality. Here are Carol Nelson and her brilliant, beautiful husband, Steve Nelson, in my play about a middle-class boy and the aristocratic bohemian whom he destroys, The Spinning Tree. The Fourth E followed me into a very, very elaborate production of Kennedy's Children. Among my favorite physical production that I did during these years was my Beaux-Arts Ball, about the models, wives, and mistresses of famous modern painters, and a few modern women painters like Mary Cassatt here. Here is the death of Modigliani's mistress. My favorite scene I have ever written is in that play. Here is Irma St. Paul as Georgia O'Keeffe comforting Carol Nelson as Marilyn Monroe at the end of the play. Those were all straight plays, but the Fourth E also did many of my gay plays. Here Mark Anderson convinces teacher Alan Gassman that learning is not enough in bread alone. Here, a young boy in New Mexico in the 50s is forced to choose between the attractions of an airman and an officer. By the way, many of my gay plays contain these promiscuous young boys. This has led many people to think that I am a boy chaser. The opposite is true. The boys represent me getting to have the kind of romantic experiences I never got to have. Got that, historians? The boys are me. Here was the most successful poster I ever had for a show. We did many nude shots of Steve Nelson and Jim Del Priore for Mercy Drop. And at the very last moment, after they had dressed after posing, the photographer happened to snap this shot, which was so touching that we used it instead. It was very successful. Now, in this play, I am not the boy. One can use playwriting to fulfill many fantasies. In this play, I am a brilliant playwright, which of course I am in real life, but I'm also beautiful, played by Steve Nelson. It was great fun. Here is just about my favorite shot from a Fourth E play. This is from my Michelangelo's models, with Steve Nelson as the model and Patrick Angus as Michelangelo. That was our greatest financial success. I continued to do plays in many, many places, many plays, many kinds of plays. Things were changing. Here is Blue is for Boys in its fourth production in New York, which we did as a benefit for the Harvey Milk High School. The producer stole most of the money, including half of what was intended for the high school. Nothing like that had ever happened to me before. It shook me very much. The play won twice from two consecutive Manhattan Borough presidents, won proclamations as the first play about the problems of gay teenagers. No newspaper in New York mentioned these proclamations. It's an unprecedented honor, the same play getting two proclamations. No, not even the gay papers mentioned it. Nor did any of them mention when The Trial of Socrates was the first gay play produced by the city of New York at the O'Neill Library. It was getting harder and harder to find decent people to work with, to get press, harder for a show to have added life after its first production. Long-running shows like Blues for Boys, from which I made, of course, not a cent. Rehearsing replacements for them wore me out. I was without a home. I was without money. I'd made some very bad business decisions. Finally, one day, when she saw me carrying a sofa on my back into a theater for a production, my most frequent collaborator, Carol Nelson, said to me, "Bob, I know why I do this. I get to wear pretty clothes, I get a lot of attention, and I feel like I'm not just an office worker. But I've always meant to ask you, why do you do it?" And in 1990, finally, I had no answer for her. I went, of course, to Ellen Stewart and asked her if I could have a theater to do my last show in New York. Ellen unstintingly, instantly gave me all the facilities of the now world-famous La Mama. I did a show about what it was like to be a success, called Hello Bob. 23 scenes with 23 people from my travels. Carol played all of the women. Here they are, actors, writers, directors, hustlers, whores, singers, dancers, crazy strangers that he meets on the street or in buses, school teachers, relatives he's forgotten. And here is the cast of Hello Bob taking the last bow after the last performance of my last production in New York. The New York Times reviewed this play drawn from my own life, hid the review under the chess problem, and said I must be insane. And that was how my career in theater ended. I accepted a long-standing invitation to go live with relatives in a small upstate California town. Here is its bustling Main Street. My relatives had no babies for me to take care of now, so they put me to dog sitting. The only artistic outlet was painting awards banners for my sister's Mary Kay awards ceremonies. She was a head Mary Kay dealer. I did make a video of a family reunion. Here I am in it. As I think you can see, I was going quite mad. I actually voted for the first time in my life in this town. Here I am voting for Clinton, while against the first Bush, because things were just horrible. I'd been away from the real world for 30 years in theater. I didn't realize how bad things had gotten, how frightened and isolated people were. I thought maybe politics was the way to solve it. Friends who dropped in to visit me, like Aaron Frick, the author of Reflections of a Rock Lobster, saw that I was going mad and begged me to get out. But I couldn't find any way out. But remember, I was raised by Joe Chino and Ellen Stewart. Joe told us, do what you have to do, and Ellen showed us how to endure and surmount all of the obstacles that people put in your way. I was raised by them, and so were all the people I love best. Remember, these are the people that created Lanford Wilson, John Guare, Tom Ian, Sam Shepard, Hare, William M. Hoffman, Dames at Sea, Paul Foster, Jesus Christ Superstar, and Godspell, as well as unlikely creatures like Harvey Fierstein and me. Harvey revived the haunted host in New York and in Europe. I was brought to New York to accept an award for a lifetime achievement in gay playwriting. I wrote a novel, a very fictionalized, highly romanticized version of the origins of off-Broadway called Temple Slave. In New York, Larry Lane, and in Chicago, Michael Martin did my play about my love life, Heaven on Earth. But at the same time, I wrote a play called Heterosexuals about living with my relatives, which I sent out to literally hundreds of theaters, and no one would produce. I also wrote what I consider my best play, Hollywood at Sunset. Similarly, I sent it out worldwide. No one would produce it. It was the last play I wrote in 1994. I got a chance for a job in LA from a friend who had a PR firm and jumped at it. I was very happy doing that job, and then when that firm failed, I got a job reviewing pornographic movies, which is how I make my living today. However, Doric Wilson Doric had founded the first openly gay theater, Tosos, back in 1975. It had closed, but in the 1990s he reopened it as Tosos 2. And Doric did my play, Hollywood at Sunset. Ironically, here is the cast and company in 2004 receiving an award for the best production of 2004 of a play I wrote in 1994. I'm sorry, I was brought up off-Broadway, where you go into a theater and say, hi, I got a play, when you got a date. And Joe Chino or Ellen Stewart said, Tuesday's open. Or you'd walk in and they'd say, a play didn't show up. Can you get one together in 2 days? Just not used to waiting 10 years for production. But you never do know what's going to happen. 10 years after Hollywood at Sunset, 20 years after Michelangelo's Models, 30 years after Kennedy's Children, 40 years after The Haunted Host, my friend Bill Houck at Arroyo Grande High School adapted a screenplay of mine into a play. It's called Delusion, and it's about rich kids who are committing suicide, or are they? Some kids out in Venice revived Michelangelo's models in an obviously splendid production. I wrote an autobiography in the form of movie reviews called Film Noir, and 2 plays from opposite ends of my career, Michelangelo's Models and Hollywood at Sunset, were published by United Stages last year. So you never do know. So here I am. Just a minute. In Los Angeles in 2006, saying, here I am, there you are. None of us knows what will happen, but obviously some of the things are going to be good. I want to thank Ellen Stewart and Joe Chino for existing and giving me and the people who support me the vision and stamina to do so. I want to thank Jim Gossage and Ren D'Antonio and all the friends who provided all the beautiful photos above. And I hope anyone who sees this will contact me. My email address is rbrtptrck@aol.com. That's my name, Robert Patrick, without the vowels, rbrtptrck@aol.com. I hope to hear from you. I look forward to hearing from you, because after all, this is only the end of part 3. So, goodbye to all of you, and the very, very best wishes.